I was back in that office again, the same nightmare that visited me every single night for 40 years. My fingers flew across the typewriter keys while rain hammered the windows of Harrington and Sons. Click. The door locked behind me. My heart exploded into a violent rhythm. Sweat erupted across my forehead, and that familiar metallic taste of pure terror flooded my mouth. Victor Harrington's shadow fell across my desk as his hand reached for my shoulder. I jerked awake in my Manhattan apartment sheets soaked in cold perspiration, gasping like I'd been drowning. The clock read 3:17 a.m. October 15th, 1998, exactly 40 years since the night that nearly destroyed me, then saved my life in ways I never could have imagined. When I say miracle, I don't mean anything supernatural or mystical. I mean how the most horrific moment of my existence, when my boss, Victor Harrington, shattered my leg with a brass lamp during a fit of murderous rage, accidentally became the key that unlocked my freedom from months of brutal sexual assault. What I thought was the end of everything turned out to be the beginning of justice. Sometimes the worst catastrophes contain hidden gifts, though you can't see them until years later, when the pain finally makes sense. My name is Eleanor Catherine Hayes, and I'm writing this memoir because tomorrow I'm meeting face-to-face with Rebecca Harrington Walsh, Victor's daughter, for the first time. She's 58 now, the same age I was when her father died alone and disgraced, and she's bringing her own daughter Sarah to thank me for something I never knew I'd done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story begins in 1957 when I was 22 and stupid enough to believe that hard work and talent could protect a woman from monsters disguised as mentors. I stepped off the Greyhound bus at Port Authority on April 12, 1957, carrying $37, 2 rope-tied suitcases, and dreams that felt bigger than the Manhattan skyline stretching before me. Behind me in Millfield, Pennsylvania, my father, William Hayes, was coughing up blood every morning while pretending his black lung disease wasn't killing him. My mother, Margaret, fried eggs with hands that shook from exhaustion and worry, taking in laundry to keep our family from starving. "Eleanor's gonna save us all!" My father wheezed to anyone who'd listen, his voice barely above a whisper after 35 years breathing coal dust. "That girl's got brains. She's gonna make something of herself in the big city." The pressure of being my family's only hope sat on my shoulders like a 100-pound weight, but I carried it willingly. My younger siblings needed everything. Tommy, 16, had already dropped out of school to work at Peterson's grocery for $8 a week. Sarah, 14, wore the same 3 dresses to school because we couldn't afford more. Little Beth, only 9, sometimes went to bed hungry when money ran out before payday. I'd graduated first in my class from Millfield Secretarial School, typing 92 words per minute without errors and taking shorthand faster than my teachers could dictate. The plan was simple: find a good job in New York, send money home every Friday without fail, and work my way up to something better than typing other people's words. I wanted to write advertising copy, those clever phrases that made people buy soap or cigarettes or dreams of better lives. The job interview at Harrington and Sons took place on April 20th, 1957, in a gleaming Madison Avenue building that smelled like success and expensive cologne. Victor Harrington Jr. was 44, silver-haired, devastatingly handsome in the way that powerful men often are, not because of perfect features, but because everything about him radiated confidence and control. His office overlooked Central Park through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed autumn leaves like museum paintings. "Miss Hayes," he said, standing to shake my hand with a grip that lasted several seconds too long. "Your typing speed is exceptional. Tell me what drives a small-town girl to seek her fortune in New York City." I explained about my father's illness, our family's financial struggles, my burning desire to build a career in advertising, rather than just marking time until marriage. Victor listened, with what seemed like genuine interest, nodding at appropriate moments and asking follow-up questions that proved he was actually paying attention. "I admire ambition," he said, finally leaning back in his leather chair that probably cost more than my family earned in 6 months. "Too many young women these days just want to type letters until they find husbands to support them. But you want something more substantial, don't you? Yes, sir, I replied, fighting to keep desperation out of my voice. I want to learn the advertising business from the ground up. Maybe write copy someday. His smile was warm, almost fatherly. That's exactly what I hope to hear. I believe in mentoring talented young people. Eleanor, may I call you? Eleanor, work hard for me, and I guarantee you'll go places in this industry. He hired me on the spot at $65 a week, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Walking back to my tiny fourth-floor apartment that evening, I felt invincible. I called home from the payphone in my building's lobby, shouting the good news over the crackling long-distance connection. Oh, honey, my mother cried, and I could hear tears in her voice. Your father's gonna be so proud. This changes everything for us. That night, I wrote my first letter home as a working woman in Manhattan, describing the magnificent office, my kind boss, and my plans to send money every Friday starting immediately. I thought I was writing the opening chapter of a fairy tale. I had no idea I was documenting the beginning of a nightmare that would nearly destroy me before accidentally setting me free. The first 6 weeks at Harrington & Sons felt like living inside a dream. I arrived at 7:30 every morning, staying until well past 6 to finish projects and absorb everything I could about the advertising world. My desk sat in the secretarial pool with 8 other women. But Victor quickly began assigning me special projects that set me apart from the crowd. Eleanor has a remarkable eye for detail, he announced during our weekly staff meeting, holding up a client report I'd typed and organized. She catches errors that slip past everyone else. This is the kind of thoroughness that builds careers. The other secretaries started treating me differently, some with obvious envy, others with the careful deference people show someone they think is rising above their station. Mary Kowalski, a Polish girl from Queens who'd been there 3 years, was the most direct about it. You're lucky, you know, she said one afternoon as we ate sandwiches in the building's cramped cafeteria. Mr. Harrington doesn't usually take personal interest in new girls. Most of us are practically invisible to him. He says he likes mentoring people with potential. I replied, taking her comment as a compliment rather than a warning. Mary's expression shifted to something I couldn't quite identify, pity mixed with something that might have been fear. Just be careful, honey. Men like that don't do favors without expecting payment in return, and I don't mean money. I dismissed her words as jealousy born of her own lack of advancement. Mary had been typing the same kinds of reports since 1954, while I was already trusted with client correspondence and campaign summaries after just 6 weeks. I thought I was special, chosen for rapid promotion because of my talent and dedication. Looking back now, the naivety of that belief makes me physically ill. Victor's attention felt wonderful initially. He called me into his office regularly to review work, explaining the strategic thinking behind different advertising campaigns and sharing war stories about famous accounts he'd won or lost. These conversations often stretched past normal business hours, but I stayed eagerly hungry for knowledge about the industry I intended to conquer. You remind me of myself at your age, he said one evening in early December as we reviewed layouts for a cigarette advertisement. Ambitious, intelligent, willing to work harder than anyone else. That's how you succeed in this business, Eleanor. That's how you rise above mediocrity. The inappropriate touching began during these late sessions. At first, it was subtle, his hand settling on my lower back, while we stood at his desk, reviewing proofs, fingers brushing mine when he handed me documents, standing closer than necessary when explaining campaign strategies. Each incident was minor enough that I questioned my own reactions. Was this normal workplace behavior? Was I being oversensitive? You have excellent instincts for this work, he murmured one evening, his breath warm against my ear as his hand pressed firmly against my spine. I can see you going very far in this company, very far indeed. When his hand moved lower, sliding across my hip with obvious intention, I stepped away quickly and pretended I needed to reach for a file. The moment passed without acknowledgement, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing or misunderstood innocent mentorship for something darker and more dangerous. The uncertainty was almost worse than the touching itself. I began second-guessing every interaction, wondering if my discomfort meant I was ungrateful for opportunities other women would kill for. Maybe this was simply how successful men behaved with promising employees. Who was I to complain about behavior that might be completely innocent? The first rape happened on Thursday evening, January 23, 1958. A blizzard had buried Manhattan under 8 inches of snow, and most of the office had left early to beat the storm. I stayed behind to finish typing an urgent proposal, working alone in the empty secretarial pool while wind howled against the windows like something alive and angry. Around 7 o'clock, I heard Victor's office door open. "Eleanor!" He called, his voice carrying a different quality than I'd heard during business hours, softer, more intimate, somehow threatening. "Could you come in here for a moment? I need to discuss something important with you." I found him behind his desk, with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, looking relaxed in a way that made my skin crawl. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat near his elbow, amber liquid catching light from his desk lamp. The sight of alcohol explained the strange tone in his voice and the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been watching your work very carefully, Eleanor, and I'm extremely impressed. Extremely impressed indeed." I settled into the chair with my notepad ready, assuming he wanted to dictate something urgent. Instead, he stood and moved around the desk to perch on its edge directly in front of me, close enough that our knees almost touched. The smell of whiskey on his breath made my stomach lurch with sudden nausea. "Do you understand what separates successful women from failures in this business?" He asked, his voice taking on that intimate quality that made every nerve in my body scream warnings. "It's not just talent or hard work, though those matter. It's understanding how relationships really develop between people who want to help each other succeed." Before I could respond, he reached out and touched my face fingers, tracing along my jawline with a gentleness that felt more threatening than violence might have. I sat frozen in that chair, paralyzed by confusion and terror, while my mind raced to process what was happening to the life I'd worked so hard to build. "You're very beautiful, Eleanor," he whispered, leaning closer until I could count the pores on his nose, "and very naive about how the world actually works. Let me educate you about business relationships." What followed was the complete destruction of every innocent belief I'd held about fairness, merit, and the rewards that came to people who worked hard and followed rules. Victor forced himself on me right there in his office, pushing me down onto the same desk where we'd reviewed advertising campaigns and discussed my brilliant future in the industry. I stared at the neon Coca-Cola sign across the street, red letters pulsing through the snow like a distant heartbeat, and let my mind float away from my body while he violated me on quarterly reports and client contracts. The pain was overwhelming, but worse was the knowledge that this was destroying everything I'd worked for, everything my family was counting on. "This is how business really works, Eleanor," he said afterward, straightening his tie while I pulled my torn blouse closed with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. "Successful relationships require mutual cooperation and understanding. You help me, I help you. It's a very simple arrangement." He handed me a $20 bill, more money than I made in 3 days of typing, and told me to take a taxi home because of the snow. The gesture felt obscene, like payment for services rendered, but I took the money because I needed car fare, and my shock had left me incapable of any kind of principled resistance. The taxi ride home passed in a blur of streetlights and numbness that felt like being wrapped in cotton. In my tiny studio apartment, I sat on my narrow bed and stared at that $20 bill until dawn broke gray and cold outside my window, trying to understand what had just happened to my carefully planned life. I didn't report the rape to police or management. In 1958, the concept of workplace sexual harassment didn't exist in any legal sense that might have protected me. Women who complained about male behavior were labeled troublemakers, fired for attitude problems, and blacklisted from other positions throughout the city. I had no evidence except my torn clothing and the bitter taste of violation coating my throat like poison. More importantly, I couldn't afford to lose this job under any circumstances. My father's medical bills were mounting like storm clouds, and my weekly money orders were the only thing standing between my family and complete destitution. Tommy's grocery store wages barely covered rent on our company house, and my mother's laundry income wasn't enough to buy food for 4 people, let alone medicine for my dying father. The assaults became a regular pattern happening every week or two depending on Victor's mood and business schedule. He developed an efficient system for ensuring privacy, working late on evenings when the cleaning crew had different schedules, dismissing other employees early for manufactured reasons, keeping a bottle of whiskey in his desk drawer to steady his nerves afterward. Each violation followed the same script summons to his office after hours false praise for my work performance physical force disguised as business mentorship and cash payment afterward, like I was a prostitute rather than an employee trying to build a legitimate career. The routine nature of it was almost worse than the violence itself, turning each assault into just another part of my job description. I began changing in ways that others noticed but couldn't understand or explain. My appetite vanished completely, and my clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed to shrink weakly. Dark circles appeared under my eyes from sleepless nights, haunted by memories of Victor's hands, his whiskey breath, his weight crushing me against cold desk surfaces, while city lights twinkled through the windows like indifferent stars. Physical contact with anyone became unbearable. When Mary Kowalski patted my shoulder sympathetically after finding me crying in the bathroom during lunch break, I jerked away so violently that I knocked over her coffee cup, spilling brown liquid across the white tile floor. "Jesus, Eleanor!" she exclaimed, dabbing at the coffee stain on her yellow skirt with paper towels. "What's wrong with you lately? You jump every time someone touches you, even accidentally." "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been under a lot of pressure with my father's medical bills. I guess I'm more stressed than I realized." The lie came easily, because it was partially true, and because explaining the real reason would have meant admitting something I couldn't even admit to myself yet. Mary accepted my explanation with the casual sympathy women showed each other in those days when personal struggles were expected to be handled privately without disrupting workplace harmony. But the isolation was killing me slowly, like poison administered in small doses over months. I started questioning everything about my situation, wondering if I had somehow invited Victor's attention through my behavior or ambition. Maybe women who wanted careers beyond marriage and motherhood were supposed to accept this treatment as the price of advancement. Maybe I was being ungrateful for opportunities that other girls would embrace without complaint. These doubts ate away at my remaining self-worth more effectively than Victor's physical violations. During the long hours between assaults, I replayed every interaction we'd had since my first day, searching for signs that I had misled him or sent inappropriate signals somehow. The uncertainty became its own form of torture, making me feel partially responsible for his choices and my own suffering. By autumn 1958, I was barely recognizable as the confident young woman who had stepped off that Greyhound bus 18 months earlier. Victor's control over my life was complete and systematic. He dictated my work schedule, my social interactions with other employees, even my emotional responses through the careful application of rewards and punishments that kept me compliant and silent. But October 15th, 1958 changed everything in ways that neither Victor nor I could have predicted. What started as another routine violation ended with my leg shattered and his carefully constructed system of abuse exposed to scrutiny he couldn't control or manipulate away. The worst night of my life accidentally became the first day of my freedom, though I wouldn't understand that for weeks to come. The weather that evening was apocalyptic, thunder exploding overhead like artillery fire, while rain hammered the city in sheets that turned afternoon into premature night. I was filing quarterly reports when Victor emerged from his office at 7:45, loosening his tie with that familiar, predatory expression I'd learned to fear more than death itself. "Eleanor." He said, his voice already slurred from whatever he'd been drinking in his office. "I need you to stay late tonight. We have some very important correspondence to handle together." The building was tomb silent except for thunder rumbling through the walls and rain streaking the windows in rivers that distorted the city lights below. In his office, Victor was more aggressive than usual, fueled by alcohol, and what I later learned was mounting pressure from business partners who were questioning his increasingly erratic behavior at work. When he grabbed my arm and tried to push me toward his desk with that familiar routine, something inside me finally snapped like an overstretched rubber band. Maybe it was accumulated rage from 18 months of violations, or simple exhaustion from carrying unbearable weight for too long, or just the knowledge that I couldn't survive much more without losing what remained of my sanity. For the first time since January, I fought back with everything I had. "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking through the office like a whip. "I won't let you do this to me anymore." I shoved him backward with strength I didn't know I possessed, my hands connecting with his chest, hard enough to send him stumbling against his bookshelf. His face transformed in slow-motion surprise, melting into confusion, then hardening into pure rage that made him look demonic in the lightning flashes illuminating his office. "Yeah, you little bitch!" He snarled, his carefully maintained facade of civilized behavior evaporating to reveal something savage and murderous underneath. "You think you can just say no to me? You think you have any fucking choice in this matter?" He grabbed the heavy brass lamp from his desk, a solid piece that weighed at least 20 pounds, and swung it at my leg like a baseball bat. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing off the office walls. My shin bone cracked with a wet, terrible noise that I can still hear in nightmares 4 decades later. Agony exploded through my entire body, white-hot and consuming, dropping me to the expensive carpet where I screamed with the full force of my lungs. Blood soaked through my torn stockings, pooling beneath the shattered remains of what had been my left leg, while bone fragments ground against each other under my skin like broken glass. But even through the overwhelming physical anguish, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 18 months, complete honesty. The pain was clean and pure compared to the psychological torture I'd endured, and for the first time since that January night, I was fully present in my own body instead of floating somewhere safe above the violence. Victor stood over me, clutching the lamp, his face white with shock at what he'd done. In all his careful planning and systematic abuse, he'd never intended to leave visible evidence of his behavior. Bruises on my thighs could be hidden beneath skirts, but a shattered leg would require hospitals, doctors' police reports, official scrutiny he couldn't control or dismiss with intimidation. "Ah, Jesus Christ," he whispered, dropping the weapon with a metallic crash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "Eleanor, this was an accident, do you understand me? You fell and hit your leg on the desk corner. That's what happened here, a terrible workplace accident." But I was beyond listening to his desperate damage control efforts. The pain had transported me to a place where only truth existed, where lies and manipulation couldn't penetrate or confuse me anymore. I screamed until my throat was raw, screamed until people in neighboring buildings called the police, screamed until paramedics burst through doors Victor had forgotten to lock in his panic. The ambulance ride passed in a morphine haze of sirens and flashing lights, but I remained conscious enough to understand that something fundamental had shifted in my favor. For 18 months, my suffering had been invisible, denied, dismissed as imagination or hysteria, whenever I'd tried to hint at the truth. Now suddenly it had weight and substance that couldn't be explained away with smooth words or family connections. At St. Mary's Hospital emergency room, doctors worked to set my shattered bones, while police officers took notes about workplace accidents and unfortunate incidents. Victor arrived 30 minutes after the ambulance, his story already polished, and his family's attorney presumably on standby. The Harrington name had opened doors and closed uncomfortable questions in this city for 3 generations. Detective Robert Murphy was a tired man in his 50s, with coffee-stained shirts and the weary expression of someone who'd investigated too many cases where the truth was less important than political convenience. He took my statement while nurses cleaned blood from my wounds and prepared me for emergency surgery. "So you're claiming this wasn't an accident, Miss Hayes?" he asked, his pen poised over a notepad that looked like it had seen better decades. "He attacked me with the lamp." I said my words slurred by pain medication, but clear enough to understand perfectly. "He's been forcing himself on me for months. When I finally tried to fight back, he tried to kill me." Detective Murphy's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, not belief or disbelief, but the particular caution of a man who understood this case would be more politically complicated than a simple assault report. Victor Harrington Jr. wasn't just any suspect. He was connected to people who could destroy careers and end investigations with a few strategic phone calls. "Those are very serious allegations, Miss Hayes," Murphy said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering bad news gently. "Do you have any evidence to support these claims about ongoing abuse witnesses who saw something, documentation, physical proof of these encounters you're describing?" I stared at him through the morphine fog, understanding perfectly what he was really asking. Did I have anything that would convince a jury to believe a secretary's word against a Harrington's testimony? The answer was obviously no, and we both knew it with absolute certainty. Recovery stretched across the following weeks like a prison sentence served in my tiny apartment, where I navigated between bed and bathroom on crutches that left my hands blistered and raw. Each movement sent bolts of agony through healing bone that made me gasp and curse in ways that would have scandalized my Pennsylvania family. The medical bills arrived in relentless waves that threatened to drown me financially. Surgery costs alone reached $800, more than 3 months of my former salary, followed by hospital fees, physician charges, and physical therapy appointments that would stretch months into an uncertain future. My savings evaporated like morning dew, and the money I'd been sending home stopped flowing completely. My mother's letters became increasingly frantic as their situation deteriorated without my weekly support. "Eleanor, honey, what's happening up there?" she wrote in her careful script that I'd learned to read by lamplight as a child. "Your father keeps asking about the money. Tommy's hours got cut at Peterson's, and we're 3 weeks behind on rent. Mrs. Patterson says if we can't pay by Friday, we'll have to find somewhere else to live." I couldn't explain that their salvation had become their destruction, that the golden opportunity I'd described in such glowing terms had turned into a nightmare that consumed everything it touched. How could I admit that their faith in my abilities had been completely misplaced? Victor visited my apartment twice during recovery, bringing expensive flowers and carefully worded expressions of concern, while his eyes conveyed unmistakable threats about the consequences of continued resistance to his version of events. He spoke in euphemisms designed to sound supportive to anyone who might be listening, but his meaning was crystal clear to both of us. "Everyone at the office is extremely concerned about your recovery, Eleanor," he said during his second visit, arranging white roses in a crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "We're all hoping you'll be back on your feet very soon, ready to put this unfortunate accident behind us and move forward with your promising career." His emphasis on specific words, accident, promising career, reminded me that my future depended entirely on accepting his narrative about what had happened that night. Speaking any version of the truth would mean unemployment, blacklisting from other positions, and the complete financial collapse of my family back home. He held every card in this deadly serious game. The police investigation proceeded exactly as I'd expected, with Detective Murphy interviewing Victor twice and accepting his account of a regrettable workplace accident involving a secretary who had tripped and fallen against office furniture during a late evening work session. Without witnesses or prior complaints, there was no basis for criminal charges against someone with the Harrington family's political connections. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," Murphy told me during his final visit to my hospital room, his tone suggesting he actually was sorry, but powerless to change anything. Mr. Harrington's story is consistent with the injury patterns our experts examined, and frankly, accidents like this happen more often than you might think. Sometimes, people just fall at exactly the wrong angle. But lying in that hospital bed staring at the white plaster cast that encased my leg from ankle to thigh, I experienced something unexpected and potentially revolutionary. This visible evidence couldn't be dismissed or explained away as easily as psychological trauma that left no physical marks. For the first time in 18 months, I had proof that something terrible had happened to Eleanor Hayes, proof that existed outside my own testimony and couldn't be denied by men in expensive suits. The cast became my salvation in ways I couldn't have imagined during those first agonizing weeks of recovery. Unlike the invisible wounds Victor had inflicted through systematic sexual abuse, this injury demanded acknowledgement from everyone who saw it. Insurance companies would investigate it thoroughly. Medical professionals would document every detail. Social workers would evaluate its impact on my ability to work and support myself. 3 months after the assault, my salvation arrived in the unexpected form of Janet Riley, a secretary from Harrington and Sons whom I barely knew personally. She appeared at my apartment door on a cold February afternoon, carrying homemade soup and information that would change the entire trajectory of my life. Janet was approaching 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the cautious demeanor of someone who'd survived 30 years in corporate environments by learning exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. She'd worked for the Harrington family since 1943, witnessing changes and patterns that younger employees couldn't perceive or fully understand. "There are things you need to know, Eleanor," she said after we'd exhausted small talk about my recovery progress and meaningless office gossip. "About Mr. Harrington and certain behavioral patterns that go back many years. You're not the first girl to leave suddenly after complications arose." She spoke in careful euphemisms at first, testing my willingness to hear uncomfortable truths that could be dangerous for both of us if repeated to the wrong people. But as our conversation developed, Janet revealed a history that explained everything about my own experiences while making them infinitely more horrifying. Susan Walsh in 1954, who'd quit abruptly after what office rumors described as a personal conflict with management. Linda Morrison in 1956 transferred to another department following inappropriate workplace tensions. Margaret Peck in 1955, who'd simply vanished one day without notice or forwarding address. The pattern repeated itself every year or two with clockwork precision. "The older secretaries remember everything," Janet explained, stirring her coffee with nervous energy while glancing around my apartment as if Victor might be hiding in the shadows. "We whisper about it sometimes during breaks, but nobody talks openly because we all need our jobs. The pattern always repeats. A promising new girl catches Mr. Harrington's special attention, receives extra assignments and praise for several months, then disappears under mysterious circumstances that management explains away. This revelation hit me like physical violence. I wasn't unique or specially chosen or even unlucky. I was simply the latest victim in a systematic pattern of predation that Victor had been perfecting for over a decade, isolating each woman completely and convincing her that her experience was shameful and unprecedented. "There's something else," Janet continued, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "A young lawyer named Thomas Reed, who works with civil rights cases and takes clients who can't afford expensive legal fees. Someone mentioned he might be interested in workplace justice issues, especially cases involving systematic abuse of power by men in positions of authority." She left his business card on my kitchen table like it was contraband, a small piece of cardboard that represented more hope than I'd dared to feel in months. That night, I stared at Thomas Reed's name and address until I'd memorized every letter, wondering if one desperate secretary could possibly challenge the Harrington empire and survive the attempt. Thomas Reed operated from a cramped office above Goldberg's Delicatessen in Greenwich Village, surrounded by law books threatening to avalanche from overstuffed shelves and case files covering every horizontal surface like paper snow. He was perhaps 35 with prematurely gray hair and the intense focus of someone fighting uphill battles against better-funded opponents who played by different rules. When I called his office explaining my situation in vague terms, he agreed to meet immediately. His secretary, Dorothy, a fierce, middle-aged black woman who treated everyone with protective efficiency, ushered me into his office and provided coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "So tell me everything from the beginning," Thomas said, without preamble, pulling out yellow legal pads and fountain pens like weapons prepared for war. "Don't leave out details you think might be embarrassing or irrelevant. In cases like this, everything potentially matters." I told him about Victor's systematic sexual abuse, the economic pressures that had trapped me in an impossible situation, and the assault that had finally provided concrete evidence of his capacity for violence. Thomas listened without interruption, taking rapid notes while his expressions cycled through professional interest, growing anger, and something that looked like recognition. "The legal challenge," he explained when I'd finished, "is building a case that can actually win in 1958 America, where sexual harassment isn't a recognized concept yet. But assault and battery are well-established charges, and your broken leg provides physical evidence that's much harder to dismiss than testimony alone." Thomas had been thinking about these issues longer than I'd realized. He'd handled similar cases involving women sexually abused by male supervisors, but unable to prove their claims in courts biased toward wealthy white men. Successful prosecution required overwhelming evidence or extraordinary circumstances that made denial impossible. "What we need," he continued, sketching legal strategies on his notepad, "is to establish a clear pattern of abusive behavior that makes the lamp incident look like escalation rather than an isolated workplace accident. If we can demonstrate that Victor Harrington has a documented history of inappropriate conduct toward female employees, then your injury becomes evidence of systematic violence." The strategy was brilliant, but extraordinarily dangerous. Filing a civil lawsuit would mean declaring war against people with unlimited resources, political connections I couldn't match, and legal representation that would make Thomas's operation look like a children's game. If we lost, I would face complete financial ruin and permanent blacklisting from employment anywhere in New York. "I want to fight," I told Thomas, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "Whatever the risks, whatever it costs, I want to make him pay for what he's done to me, and God knows how many other women." We filed the civil suit on March 15, 1959, claiming assault and battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and seeking damages for medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering that would affect me for the rest of my life. Local newspapers picked up the story as an interesting curiosity. Secretary sues prominent executive over workplace incident, without grasping the broader implications of what we were attempting. The breakthrough came through connections none of us had anticipated. Martha Stevens, an investigative journalist for the Village Voice, had been quietly researching workplace abuse as part of a comprehensive series on women's experiences in corporate America. Someone I never learned who tipped her off about my case and its potential significance for working women throughout the city. Martha was a tough woman in her 40s who'd fought her way into journalism when most newspapers wouldn't hire female reporters for serious assignments. She'd covered labor disputes, civil rights demonstrations, and political corruption for 15 years, developing sources and instincts that made her dangerous to people who preferred operating in shadows. Her interview took place in Thomas's office on a rainy April afternoon, with Dorothy taking careful notes while Martha asked questions that cut straight to the heart of systematic workplace abuse. She understood immediately that my case represented something larger than individual trauma. It was evidence of institutional failures affecting thousands of women who suffered in silence. "Your story isn't really about you personally, Eleanor," she explained, reviewing her notes while rain drummed against the windows. "It's about a system designed to protect predators and silence victims that treats women's bodies as acceptable casualties of male ambition and entitlement. Your willingness to fight back makes visible what everyone knows, but nobody discusses publicly." Martha's article appeared under the headline, "The Hidden Costs of Ambition: How Workplace Abuse destroys dreams and lives. She didn't name Victor directly, but painted a devastating portrait of systematic predation disguised as career mentorship, interviewing labor organizers, social workers, and other journalists who'd encountered similar patterns throughout corporate America. The article's impact shocked everyone involved. Letters poured into the Village Voice from readers sharing comparable experiences, and newspapers in other cities began investigating workplace abuse in their own regions. The story had touched something raw and infected in American professional life, exposing systematic problems that everyone suspected, but nobody had documented so thoroughly. Victor's legal team struck back with predictable tactics designed to destroy my credibility and break my will to continue fighting. Crawford Whitman and Associates. His family's prestigious law firm hired private investigators to excavate my background, searching for anything that might suggest ulterior motives, mental instability, or questionable moral character. The depositions were psychological warfare conducted in oak-paneled conference rooms where Victor's attorneys tried to break me through exhaustive questioning about every aspect of my employment, personal relationships, and financial situation. They wanted to establish that I'd encouraged Victor's attention, accepted his gifts willingly, and fabricated assault allegations to extort money after a genuine workplace accident. "Isn't it true, Miss Hayes," demanded Crawford's senior partner during one particularly brutal 8-hour session, "that you were flattered by Mr. Harrington's personal interest and actively encouraged his romantic attention to advance your career prospects?" "No," I replied steadily, despite the trembling in my hands that made holding my water glass difficult. "I was terrified of losing my job and watching my family lose their home because I couldn't send money anymore." "But you did accept monetary gifts from Mr. Harrington on multiple occasions, didn't you? $20 bills after late work sessions, expensive dinners at restaurants you couldn't afford, even a Christmas bonus significantly larger than other secretaries received. I took money he forced on me after raping me," I said, choosing my words carefully to avoid legal traps they were setting. "I accepted it because I needed taxi fare home and because refusing might have made him even more violent." The questioning continued for hours, designed to exhaust my emotional reserves and force contradictions in my testimony. But Thomas had prepared me thoroughly, teaching me to stick to simple truths and avoid elaborate explanations that might create new vulnerabilities for opposing counsel to exploit. Victor's own deposition revealed cracks in his carefully constructed public facade that our side exploited ruthlessly. Under oath, forced to explain the exact circumstances of the lamp incident, his story became increasingly convoluted and difficult to believe with each round of questioning. "Mr. Harrington," Thomas asked during cross-examination, "can you explain why Miss Hayes would fabricate such detailed and consistent accusations about systematic sexual abuse if her real motivation was simply to extort money following a workplace accident?" I have no idea what motivates people to make false accusations," Victor replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the conference room's efficient air conditioning. "Perhaps she's mentally unstable. Perhaps she's been influenced by outside agitators who see financial opportunity in exploiting unfortunate circumstances." The turning point came when Moses Washington approached Thomas through intermediaries who understood the enormous risks he was taking. Moses had operated the building's elevator for 18 years, maintaining equipment and emptying trash, while remaining essentially invisible to white executives who used his services daily but never really saw him as a complete human being. Moses had been working late that October night, performing routine maintenance throughout the building, while most employees had gone home to their families. He'd heard my screaming echoing through empty corridors, witnessed Victor's panic-stricken behavior in the aftermath, and watched ambulance crews carry me away on a stretcher while blood soaked through my torn clothing. More crucially, Moses had observed behavioral patterns over nearly 2 decades that corroborated everything I'd described about Victor's systematic abuse of female employees. He'd witnessed the late-night business meetings with various secretaries, noticed expensive gifts appearing on young women's desks, and seen the tears and sudden resignations that followed predictable cycles of attention and abandonment. I seen things over the years. Moses told Thomas during a secret meeting in a Harlem restaurant where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from the Harrington organization. Young ladies going into that man's office happy and hopeful, coming out looking like they'd seen the devil himself. Girls doing fine, 1 week gone, without explanation the next. Nobody allowed to ask questions about what happened. Moses's willingness to testify represented a seismic shift that terrified Victor's legal team more than any other development in our case. A black man's testimony might not carry much weight with certain judges and juries in 1959 America, but Moses's long employment record, detailed knowledge of building operations, and obvious lack of personal motivation for lying made him a credible witness whose account would be difficult to dismiss entirely. The settlement negotiations began in earnest after Moses committed to testifying conducted in mahogany-paneled conference rooms where expensive lawyers spoke in careful euphemisms about resolving differences and avoiding unnecessary publicity that might damage all parties involved. Victor's team understood that a public trial would expose his behavior to media scrutiny they couldn't control, regardless of the eventual verdict. Crawford Whitman and Associates offered increasingly generous financial settlements in exchange for comprehensive confidentiality agreements that would seal all court records permanently and prevent me from ever discussing the case publicly or privately. Thomas advised me carefully about each proposal, explaining legal implications and long-term consequences of accepting money in exchange for enforced silence. $75,000. Thomas said during our final strategy meeting, his voice reflecting the magnitude of what we were discussing. That's more money than most working women see in a lifetime. It would cover all your medical expenses, provide financial security for decades, and allow you to start completely over anywhere you choose. The decision was agonizing in ways I hadn't anticipated when we'd first filed suit. $75,000 would solve every immediate problem: medical bills, family obligations, the crushing fear of destitution that had controlled my choices for 2 years. But accepting the settlement meant Victor would face no meaningful consequences for decades of systematic abuse, no public acknowledgement of crimes he'd committed, and no protection for future victims. What about justice? I asked Thomas, staring at settlement documents that would transform my trauma into a purely financial transaction. What about making sure he can't do this to other women who might be even more vulnerable than I was? Thomas's expression was gentle but realistic about the world we were operating in. Eleanor, this is 1959 America. The legal system isn't designed to protect women like you from men like him, regardless of how much evidence we present. $75,000 isn't perfect justice, but it's more than most abuse victims ever receive. Sometimes accepting imperfect solutions is the only way to survive and rebuild. I signed the papers on May 20th, 1959, my signature transforming months of agony into legal documents that would remain sealed forever. The money appeared in my bank account 3 days later, an amount so large I had to stare at the deposit slip repeatedly to believe it was actually real and mine. But the enforced silence felt like swallowing poison that would burn in my throat for years to come. I'd won a significant battle while losing the broader war, gained personal financial security, while surrendering the right to speak truth about systematic abuse that continued affecting women throughout corporate America. The victory was real, but incomplete, satisfying practical needs, while leaving deeper wounds unhealed. Physical therapy continued through the summer, rebuilding strength in muscles that had atrophied during months of immobility. Dr. Peterson remained cautiously optimistic about my long-term prospects, though he warned that complete recovery would require patience and realistic expectations about permanent limitations. "You'll always have some stiffness during cold weather," he explained during one of our final appointments, reviewing x-rays showing bone healing in mostly straight lines. "And you might need a walking stick occasionally for longer distances. But considering the severity of the original fracture, this is actually an excellent outcome." Physical healing proved far easier than psychological recovery from 18 months of systematic abuse. Nightmares persisted, jerking me from sleep with memories of Victor's hands his whiskey breath the sound of breaking bone echoing through empty offices like gunshots. Simple triggers, men in expensive suits, office buildings at dusk. Even the smell of certain colognes could provoke panic attacks that left me gasping on street corners. Help came from Mrs. Catherine Murphy, a widow in her 60s, who lived across the hall and had noticed my struggles during recovery. She'd survived her own tragedies, losing her husband at D-Day, raising 4 children alone through the Depression, and recognized the particular exhaustion that comes from enduring what shouldn't be survivable. Healing isn't a destination you reach, dear. She told me over tea in her kitchen one evening, the room always smelling of fresh bread and unconditional acceptance. It's more like tending a difficult garden. Some days you plant new seeds of hope, other days you pull stubborn weeds of anger and fear. The important thing is showing up every single day, even when the weather looks impossible. Through Catherine's gentle guidance, I discovered informal networks of women gathering in church basements and community centers, ostensibly for cooking classes or book discussions, but really to share experiences that had no other acceptable outlet in 1950s society. These weren't organized support groups, such concepts barely existed, but they provided safe spaces where women could speak truths that polite society refused to acknowledge or validate. At St. Mary's Episcopal Church on East 61st Street, I met Sarah Goldman, a former garment worker who'd organized union activities during the 1930s. She understood long before anyone coined terms like sexual harassment that women faced systematic workplace abuse disguised as normal business practice that everyone was expected to tolerate silently. The thing about surviving trauma, Sarah explained to our small circle one humid evening, is that it makes you feel insane when you're actually seeing clearly for the first time in your life. Society is specifically designed to gaslight women who tell inconvenient truths about male behavior and institutional failures. Your job isn't to convince everyone you're mentally stable, it's to trust what you experienced and find constructive ways to act on that knowledge. These conversations planted seeds that would grow slowly over the following years. I began keeping detailed journals documenting not just my own experiences, but patterns I observed through conversations with other women who'd faced similar abuse in various forms. Stories of workplace harassment, domestic violence, educational discrimination dreams systematically destroyed all the hidden costs of being female in mid-century America. By 1961, I'd established a new life built around freelance secretarial services provided to small businesses, legal offices, and independent authors who needed manuscript preparation. The work was solitary but steady, allowing me to avoid corporate power dynamics while utilizing skills I'd developed during my brief disastrous career at Harrington & Sons. Working alone had unexpected psychological benefits beyond simple safety. Without office politics and male supervisors demanding deference, I could focus on writing projects I'd always wanted to pursue, but never had time or energy to attempt seriously. Between typing assignments, I began crafting articles about women's workplace experiences, carefully disguising personal details, while highlighting systematic problems that deserved broader public attention. Martha Stevens became an informal mentor and occasional client, hiring me to type her investigative articles while encouraging my own writing efforts. She understood the delicate balance required to address controversial subjects without triggering legal retaliation from powerful interests who preferred keeping these issues invisible. Social revolution starts with individuals telling uncomfortable truths about their lives. Martha explained during one of our monthly meetings at a village coffee shop. Your personal story isn't just about Victor Harrington, it's about institutional failures that protect predators while abandoning victims. Individual testimony becomes political action when it's strategically connected to broader patterns of systematic oppression. Through Martha's professional connections, I began placing articles in small magazines and alternative newspapers, writing under pseudonyms about workplace safety legislation, women's legal rights, and the long-term psychological costs of economic vulnerability that forced women to accept abuse as the price of survival. The advocacy work expanded gradually as I connected with other women who'd survived similar experiences and wanted to prevent future victims from suffering in the isolation that made abuse possible. We met informally at first, gathering in apartments to share resources and strategies for helping survivors navigate legal, medical, and employment challenges that seemed designed to discourage complaints. By 1963, our loosely organized group had evolved into the Manhattan Women's Advocacy Circle, providing comprehensive information about legal rights, job training opportunities, and emotional support for women facing crises related to workplace discrimination and sexual abuse. I coordinated our referral network, connecting survivors with lawyers, doctors, social workers, and employers who'd proven trustworthy during difficult circumstances. Sarah Goldman, now approaching 70, but still fierce as Arctic wind, taught us organizational tactics from her union days that proved invaluable for building sustainable advocacy programs. Individual trauma requires individual healing, she explained during planning meetings. But systematic oppression demands collective action that challenges institutional power. Personal stories become political weapons when you use them strategically to protect other women. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying in ways my corporate career had never been. Women arrived at our meetings broken by experiences they couldn't name or understand, carrying shame that belonged to their abusers rather than themselves. Through patient conversation and practical support, we helped them reclaim their stories and find paths toward healing that didn't require silence or surrender to injustice. By 1965, our organization had connected with similar groups in other cities, sharing resources and coordinating strategies while advocating for legal reforms that might provide systematic protection for working women. The civil rights movement was changing how Americans thought about institutional discrimination, creating space for conversations about women's experiences that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. I found myself writing more boldly, using my real name on articles about workplace safety legislation, legal reforms needed to protect female employees, and the long-term societal costs of systematic abuse that destroyed human potential. The settlement money had provided enough financial security to take professional risks, and my unique perspective as someone who'd survived corporate predation and fought back successfully gave my words authority that editors found compelling. One article published in McCall's magazine in September 1965, "The Hidden Price of Professional Ambition for American Women," generated dozens of letters from readers sharing their own experiences of workplace abuse. Many described patterns virtually identical to what I'd endured, confirming that Victor Harrington represented a widespread problem rather than an isolated case of individual misconduct. But the communication that would transform my understanding of justice and healing arrived on November 18, 1965, a letter that would lead directly to tomorrow's face-to-face meeting with Rebecca Harrington Walsh and her daughter Sarah. The envelope bore expensive letterhead from a Washington, D.C. law firm, but the handwriting was careful and personal rather than official. "Dear Miss Hayes, my name is Rebecca Harrington Walsh, and I am Victor Harrington Jr.'s daughter. I am writing to thank you for something I'm not sure you intended to accomplish, but which probably saved my life and certainly saved my daughter's childhood from the same damage I experienced growing up in his house. I have spent the last 7 years in therapy trying to understand why my childhood felt like walking through a minefield, why my father's presence filled our home with tension and fear that no one was allowed to discuss openly. Your lawsuit and the publicity surrounding it gave me language for experiences I couldn't name or explain to anyone, including myself. More importantly, it gave me courage to seek professional help and establish boundaries that protected both myself and my daughter from his increasingly erratic behavior. The legal documents may be sealed, but the fact that someone had fought back successfully against his abuse gave me permission to believe my own perceptions and take protective action. I am now 26, married to a kind man who doesn't understand why I still flinch when anyone raises their voice, but who accepts my need for patience and careful trust. I work as an elementary school teacher, finding deep purpose in protecting children who might face similar dangers at home or elsewhere. But most importantly, I want you to know about my 3-year-old daughter Sarah, who will grow up in a house filled with laughter instead of fear, because your courage created possibilities that didn't exist before 1958. She assumes she has the right to speak up, fight back, and demand better treatment from everyone around her. Assumptions that exist because women like you made different choices possible. I know legal agreements prevent you from responding directly, but I wanted you to understand that your suffering wasn't meaningless or wasted. The cracks you opened in his facade of respectability allowed light to reach places that had been dark for too long. Would it be possible to meet in person someday? I have so many questions about courage healing and how individual actions can create change that protects people you never know exist. My daughter and I will be in New York next month for the holidays, and it would mean everything to both of us to thank you face to face for the gift of safety you helped make possible. With profound gratitude and deep respect, Rebecca Harrington Walsh. I read Rebecca's letter 7 times before setting it down, my hands trembling with emotions I couldn't name. For 6 years, I'd wondered whether accepting that settlement had been cowardice disguised as pragmatism, whether my silence had enabled Victor to continue abusing other women with impunity. Now I learned that my fight had protected people I'd never imagined, not just future employees, but his own family members who'd been suffering in ways I hadn't considered. That evening, I wrote a response I could send legally. Dear Rebecca, your letter moved me beyond words. Yes, I would very much like to meet you and your daughter when you're in New York. The knowledge that our legal case helped protect you both means more than any amount of money or public vindication ever could. I have spent these years building advocacy programs for women facing workplace abuse, transforming my own trauma into systematic protection for others. Learning that this work helped create safety for your family feels like the completion of a circle I didn't know existed. Please call when you arrive in the city. I have so much I want to share with you about healing justice and the ways individual courage can ripple through generations to protect people we never meet. With love and anticipation of our meeting, Eleanor Hayes. We met on December 22, 1965, in my office at the Manhattan Women's Advocacy Circle. Rebecca was petite and dark-haired with her father's intelligent eyes, but none of his predatory intensity. 3-year-old Sarah was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, asking endless questions about everything she saw, while clearly feeling completely safe in the world, exactly what Rebecca had promised in her letter. I need you to understand something, Rebecca said, as Sarah played with building blocks in the corner of my office. After your lawsuit became public, everything changed in our house, even though nobody ever discussed what had happened directly. My mother started taking long trips to visit relatives, removing us from his presence for weeks at a time. When I reached adolescence, she insisted on boarding school rather than keeping me home, where his attention to young women had become impossible to ignore. She paused, watching her daughter stack blocks into elaborate towers, with the confidence of someone who'd never learned to fear authority figures. But the most important change came when Sarah was born. By then I had language for understanding what my childhood had really been like, insights from therapy and women's liberation literature that traced back to pioneers like you who'd refused to suffer in silence. Rebecca explained how she'd been able to establish firm boundaries around Victor's access to Sarah, requiring supervised visits, and eventually cutting contact entirely when he'd violated the few safety rules she'd established. These decisions had been possible because women like me had demonstrated that individual courage could challenge systematic abuse successfully. He died last month. Rebecca continued, her voice carrying complex emotions I recognized from my own experience with trauma and healing. Alone, essentially having driven away everyone who might have mourned him genuinely. But Sarah will never carry the damage that might have been her inheritance, and that's entirely because your fight created different possibilities. As we talked through that afternoon, I began to understand that the miracle I'd experienced hadn't been limited to my personal transformation and career success. It had rippled through time and relationships in ways I'd never imagined, protecting people I'd never met and preventing suffering I'd never witnessed directly. 3-year-old Sarah approached my desk, with the fearless curiosity of someone who'd never learned that adults might hurt children who asked too many questions or demanded too much attention. "Miss Eleanor," she said in her clear, confident voice. "Mommy says you're very brave. What does brave mean?" I knelt to her eye level, choosing my words carefully. "Being brave means doing the right thing, even when it's scary or difficult, Sarah. It means protecting people who need help, even when powerful people try to stop you." She nodded seriously, as if filing this information away for future reference. "I'm going to be brave too when I grow up. I want to help people like you do." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she watched her daughter's fearless interaction with the world around her. "That confidence exists because of choices you made when she was just a dream in my future," she whispered. "She assumed she has fundamental rights to safety and respect that I never dared claim at her age." Before they left that day, Rebecca handed me a photograph of Sarah building an elaborate castle from blocks, her face bright with concentration and joy. On the back, she'd written, "For Eleanor, who made childhood safe for little girls she never knew existed, with love and gratitude that will last generations." That photograph still sits on my desk today, 40 years later, reminding me daily that the miracle wasn't personal salvation or even individual justice. The miracle was discovering that one woman's refusal to accept injustice silently could echo through decades of progress, protecting daughters and granddaughters who would grow up assuming rights that previous generations had died fighting for. Standing at my apartment window this morning, watching professional women stride confidently down Broadway carrying briefcases and heading to careers that would have been unimaginable in 1957, I understand finally that some stories achieve immortality, not through their individual conclusions, but through their contributions to movements that transcend any single lifetime. Tomorrow, I'll meet Rebecca again, now 58 and a successful advocate for children's rights, along with her daughter Sarah, who became the investigative journalist Rebecca had dreamed she might be. Sarah is bringing her own daughter Emma, age 5, who will grow up in a world where workplace sexual harassment is illegal, where women have legal recourse against predators, where institutional protections exist because individual women found the courage to speak truth about systematic abuse. The terrified girl from Pennsylvania who'd stepped off that Greyhound bus 41 years ago with $37 and impossible dreams had become someone she never could have imagined, a woman who'd learned that survival itself was a form of resistance, that healing could become a weapon against oppression, and that speaking truth about injustice could create possibilities extending far beyond individual salvation towards something approaching genuine equality. My story was ending, but the larger story it had helped create would continue through women like Sarah and Emma, who would fight from positions of strength because others had gone before them, breaking ground and building foundations that made new victories possible. Some miracles disguise themselves as catastrophes, revealing their true nature only to those who survive long enough to recognize the gifts hidden within their suffering. That recognition, understanding that the worst experience of my life had become protection for countless women I would never meet, was miracle enough for any lifetime. Justice enough. Legacy enough for someone who'd learned to transform trauma into systematic change that would outlast her individual existence. The circle was complete. The miracle was real. The fight continued.